Ever since humankind first looked to the heavens, we have asked the question, are we alone? Tales of otherworldly beings, ancient prophecies and predictions, and sightings here on Earth have heightened our sense of anticipation. But in recent years, these claims have become more frequent.
Do you believe our government has made contact with intelligent extraterrestrials?
Something I can't discuss in public setting.
More insistent.
Biologics came with some of these recoveries, yeah.
And ever more dramatic. In December 1980, two senior U.S. Air Force officers claimed to have experienced prolonged UFO encounters and to have come face-to-face with advanced, non-human technology. They made a record of all they witnessed. Top-secret investigations were launched, explanations given, but the truth remained elusive. And whatever it was, it appears to have returned several times since.
Do you believe UAPs pose a potential threat to our national security?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
What are we not being told? Our team of experts reopened the files. They'll analyze the intelligence, investigate the science, and reveal the truth. Christmas 1980. Personnel at two U.S. military bases in Suffolk, England, experienced a UFO encounter. It would become probably the most famous UFO sighting on UK soil, and it has never been explained. After playing crucial roles in World War II, both RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge continued as tactical U.S. Air Force bases in Europe as the Cold War began. The twin bases were home to the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing.
The 81st Tactical Fighter Wing was the largest in the free world. This was the front line in defense of Europe.
But the presence of the fighter wing in Europe and wartime contingency missions would have made the bases a target from both the Soviets and any rogue states. And in the early 1980s, rogue states were on the rise. Soviet and U.S. nuclear arsenals grew to their highest ever levels, and key battlegrounds such as Afghanistan and Nicaragua were threatening to inflame Cold War tensions. The bases were close to international ports, which were frequently visited by Soviet ships and trawlers.
All of this meant security at these bases was as tight as it had ever been.
At around 6 p.m. on the night of Christmas Day, 26-year-old U.S. Air Force Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston checked into the guard mount room at Bentwaters before beginning his 12-hour night shift as security supervisor at RAF Woodbridge.
RAF Woodbridge had between 12 to 15 working the night shift. And before starting, every one of them had to be checked for their fitness for duty, and the equipment was in order, and they were fully debriefed on the security situation that might affect them during the shift.
A little after 11 p.m., Airman John Burroughs and his senior partner, Staff Sergeant Bud Steffens, were patrolling the base perimeter.
One of their jobs was to check the East Gate because there were no guards posted there.
Looking out into the darkness over the tall pines of Rendlesham Forest, Burroughs claims he was suddenly assailed by red, green, white, and blue lights hovering in the sky.
He says they hovered and then descended into the tree line, where they caused the forest to light up.
Just after midnight, Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston was dispatched to the East Gate by Base Security Control. As he approaches, he is brought directly to Burroughs and Steffens.
Upon arrival, I immediately asked Staff Sergeant Steffens what was going on and what was the current situation. Sergeant Steffens pointed to the perimeter, which led off from the base, and I could see way off in the distance a dome of white yellowish light over it. I wasn't sure what it was at first. The fire, in my mind, what it had to be is probably an aircraft crash. I saw yellow, red, bluish types of glowing light which were standard with crashed aircraft. The color of titanium and JP4 jet fuel burning.
As an experienced security specialist, Peniston estimates he'd seen 30 to 40 crashed planes in his career, but nothing quite like this.
I thought an aircraft, maybe an A-10, had problems and had come down in the forest, even though it was Christmas and there was no scheduled flights. However, there was no apparent smoke, no smell of smoke, or anything burning in the air.
Before setting off for the site, Peniston asked the two men if they had heard an explosion.
Steffens says to him, "No, Jim, there was no explosion and no crash. It landed."
And Burroughs kept interrupting. He was agitated and incoherent, basically babbling, saying, "I think a UFO just landed in the forest."
Knowing that no aircraft could land in the midst of a dense forest, Peniston contacted nearby RAF Bentwaters.
He tells them he thinks a military aircraft has come down, but they tell him no military aircraft has been lost.
RAF Broadsea had been tracking an unidentified bogey on radar near Bentwaters and lost it about 15 minutes earlier, near Woodbridge. I asked for backup and waited their arrival.
Peniston headed to the crash site with Burroughs and Airman Ed Cabanasac, who was on his first shift at the base.
When they get a few hundred yards from the site, Peniston's radio starts to struggle and fail.
I could not proceed any further in the Jeep due to the terrain. I set up Airman Cabanasac as the intercontroller for the first responders.
As Peniston and team continued into the forest, they began to experience unusual sensations.
I felt the hairs of my head, neck, and body stand up, like I was entering a very strong static field. I also felt the effects on my clothing. Each movement and step I took was becoming more labored. It was like walking through water chest deep.
He said that all around them, animals were going crazy and they were running out of the forest away from the site.
Then, after a few minutes, the forest went completely silent. They continued towards the craft. Peniston could now see that this was no crash.
There was no fire, scattered debris, or bodies around us or in the clearing. I called in on my radio and I was initiating a helping hand situation.
A helping hand situation is a potentially hostile encounter alert. As the bright light dissipated, the structure of the craft appeared. It was a dark mechanical object surrounded by a gray, white, yellowish bubble. Peniston tried to continue to report back.
The radio was breaking up again. I continued giving updates even though I could not receive transmissions. Burroughs was behaving erratically, so I told him to wait and I continued on my own.
But so unnerved was Burroughs by the craft that he disobeyed and continued to follow Peniston from a distance. The lights from the object were still actively flashing and pulsating.
I was worried that whatever it was might become hostile or even explode.
Peniston then turned and told Burroughs to either crouch or lay down, but Burroughs wouldn't listen.
I told him, "Stay here."
Climbing on an embankment, Peniston moved within 20 feet of the object.
My sudden presence must have triggered something because whatever it was lit up brightly. Reacting on a reflex, I immediately hit the ground, expecting to be hit by debris or the force from an explosion.
But there was no explosion, just an object surrounded by light hovering just above the ground. He could see a dome of light and multiple colored lights flashing inside the forest.
I proceeded, and in front of me was a triangular craft. When I got within 10 feet, it all dissipated. It was totally silent. No sounds of the forest or the air, or even my footsteps, just silence.
As Peniston approached, distinct circular and crescent-shaped lights began blinking on and off just under the black, shiny surface, like a digital display. Peniston wasn't the only witness. Burroughs had continued to follow him.
I looked over to my right, and I seen that he was motionless, not moving, just staring straight ahead. I yelled at him, but he seemed not to hear me.
With his radio failing again and facing a possible hostile threat, Peniston made extensive notes on what he was seeing.
His notes are remarkable. There's no break in the surface of this thing, no way to get in and out, no crew compartment, no exhaust pods, no landing gear. It's being supported by 3 pillars of light that seem to be leaving indentations in the ground.
I came around the far side of it, and I could see there was writing on the craft. It was like glyphs, stretched about 3 feet wide and about 5 or 6 inches high.
He starts drawing the craft and the symbols on the side of it. He reaches out a hand and touches them.
I was touching the glyphs, and it was like going from smooth black glass to sandpaper. When I touched the top of the triangular one, there was a blast of light. That's when I saw 1s and 0s.
Then, without warning, the craft takes off vertically, clears the trees, and accelerates away with incredible speed.
Peniston writes in his notebook, "Takeoff unknown, speed impossible."
Peniston returns to base, where he's debriefed by agents from the Office of Special Investigations, and he writes a 4-page brief recounting the incident. When he finally made it home, he was haunted by what he'd witnessed.
He can't sleep, he feels sick, and every time he does close his eyes, he sees 1s and 0s. He got out of bed at 2 a.m., grabbed his notebook and pen, and wrote down 1s and 0s, pages of them, and only when he was done did he manage to get to sleep.
On the 26th, unable to stop thinking about the strange events of Christmas Day, Jim Peniston returned to the site with his camera and some plaster.
He took photos and made plaster casts of the indentations. He hadn't finished his investigation yet.
And the strange events hadn't finished either. Two days after Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston and his colleague Airman John Burroughs had had their astonishing encounter with an unidentified craft in Rendlesham Forest, the Deputy Base Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, and his security detail were enjoying a Christmas party at a local bar when suddenly they were rudely interrupted.
Personnel burst through the doors and approached Charles Halt. The UFO is back.
He heads out to the site with his tape recorder and a half a dozen sober witnesses with one mission: to squash any stories of UFOs.
But as Halt gets closer to the site, the same spot Peniston and his team had visited just 48 hours before, his mission suddenly changes.
They notice they're having problems with their radios. Then they see the indentations in the frozen ground. They start to take samples from the trees and the soil, and some radiation readings.
There's a round abrasion on the tree about 3.5, 4 inches diameter. It looks like it might be old, but strange as a crystalline pine sap has come out that fast. You see those other trees here that are damaged in similar fashion? Yes, off towards Saturday landing site.
And the Geiger counter shows far higher radiation levels than normal.
4 clicks max. Yes, sir. If you come to the back, there's no clicks whatsoever. Looks like someone took something and sat it down and twisted it from side to side. Very strange.
The middle of the forest offers only one obvious entry point: from above.
Looking directly overhead, one can see an opening in the trees plus some freshly broken pine branches on the ground underneath. Looks like someone came off about 15 to 20 feet up. Some small branches about an inch or less in diameter.
Despite the mounting evidence, Lieutenant Colonel Holt was still unimpressed. Although what he was seeing was strange, he hadn't been considering anything as extraordinary as a UFO.
At least not yet. Just a few moments later,
I see it too. What is it? We don't know, sir. It's a strange, small red light. Looks to be out maybe a quarter to half mile, maybe further out. I'm gonna switch off. The light is gone now. It was approximately 120 degrees from the site. Is it back again? Yes, sir.
the men head towards the mysterious light.
Everything else is just deathly calm. There's no doubt about it. There's some type of strange flashing red light ahead. It's coming this way. It is definitely coming this way. Pieces of it are shooting off. There is no doubt about it. This is weird.
That's when they see the UFO themselves.
It looks like an eye winking at you. It's still moving from side to side. And when you put the star scope on it, it sort of has a hollow center, a dark center. It's like a pupil of an eye looking at you and winking. And the flash is so bright through the star scope that it almost burns your eye.
Every time they approached the craft, it moved backwards, so they decided to wait at the tree line and watch. The object just exploded into 5 white lights, and 3 of them stayed in the sky for hours.
We see strange strobe-like flashes to the rather sporadic, but there's definitely something, some kind of phenomenon. Now we're both heading north. Hey, here he comes from the south. He's coming toward us now. Now we're observing what appears to be a beam coming down to the ground. This is unreal.
The tape continued until 3:30 a.m., when Halt and his men began to head back to base, claiming the objects were still in the sky.
The following day, Halt fired off a memo outlining the events of the previous evening. It was a stripped-back retelling, just the basic facts, but it was still enough to prompt the UK Ministry of Defense and the American intelligence to launch a proper investigation.
It appears to have been ordered at the very highest level.
Normally, OSI investigations are commissioned locally by a base commander, but this one apparently came from OSI headquarters and direct from Hans Mark, Secretary of the Air Force. There were lots of different entities involved in the investigation. There was the British Police, the UK Ministry of Defense, and of course the United States Air Force themselves. A lot of samples were taken from the site. There were burn marks and scorch marks on the ground and on the sides of the trees facing the clearing where this object had been seen. Often, physical evidence of this sort is associated with very high levels of energy. General Gabriel, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Air Force in Europe, flew in personally and removed some of the items of physical evidence back to his headquarters in Ramstein, Germany. Here was the United States, our closest ally, basically doing things that they had no legal or constitutional right to do. And we were furious.
The officers interviewed all those on the base, as well as several local residents. There were key and notable differences in their testimony.
Airman Kavanasak was with Peniston and Burroughs on the 25th, and he later said, essentially, we followed some lights, but it turned out to be beacons, and it illuminated the farmhouse. He later said that he was so scared, he didn't even write his statement. He just signed what was put in front of him.
Though some accounts went much further.
A young airman called Larry Warren was on base and had only been there for a couple of weeks when the sightings happened. He describes the same craft that the others did say they saw, but he claims that although the sighting did happen that night, it was coordinated and filmed, and that the senior officers on the base approached a landed craft and spoke to the ETs inside.
According to the official report, some of the witnesses agreed to a polygraph. Larry Warren was one of them.
It showed he was lying.
His testimony had several discrepancies, including dates, times, and locations, but he had an answer for that.
He says that it only happened because he was given a watered-down statement to sign. Apparently, it was implied that if he told the true story, he would be killed.
Warren may have proven to be an unreliable witness, but not Jim Penniston. His account of the investigation hints at a cover-up.
A lot was left out of the official report. When I challenged this, I was told only wackos talk about UFOs.
It was a clear threat to Penniston's promising career. The intimidation tactics didn't stop there.
He says that they gave him sodium pentothal, which makes you incredibly suggestible.
They said the case was top secret and classified. In the military, that's a gag order.
But something did happen in Rendlesham Forest on the nights of December 25th and 26th, 1980. The investigation revealed sky-high levels of radiation at the site, and the burn marks on the ground were consistent with some form of aircraft landing there.
According to the readings on the night, and later by the official investigators, the levels were around 8 times higher.
But ultimately, no one could explain all of the events of that night. And after a while, no one seemed to want to.
The official position of the UK Ministry of Defence is slightly bizarre because on the one hand, they say that the whole Rendlesham Forest incident is completely unexplained. But on the other hand, they say there's no evidence that there was an intrusion of an unknown craft, and there's no evidence of any defense threat to the United Kingdom.
Charles Halt continued serving in the Air Force for another 10 years before retiring as a full colonel. He has never changed his story. I believe the objects that I saw at close quarter were extraterrestrial in origin, and that the security services of the United States and the United Kingdom have attempted both then and now to subvert the significance of what occurred at Rendlesham Forest and RAF Bentwaters by use of well-practiced methods of disinformation. Jim Penniston also continued in the Air Force, serving until 1993 before retiring and joining the lecture circuit about his experiences. But the story didn't end there. There was a significant late development. Penniston's notebook filled with ones and zeros that he'd felt compelled to write down on the night of the encounter, even though he had no idea what they meant.
He just wrote them down in his notebook, put it away, and then put the whole matter out of his mind for years.
Then, in 2010, they were decoded.
Burroughs one day asked me about a specific date in the notebook, which led him to seeing the pages of the ones and zeros, something I kept private up to that point.
A full message came out.
The message included a list of coordinates.
So these latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates exactly matched some of the most important sacred sites anywhere in the world. The Great Pyramids, the Temple of Apollo, the Nazca Lines, and so forth.
So, 40 years on from one of the most infamous ever UFO sightings, can our experts make sense of what happened in Rendlesham Forest? Over 2 nights in December 1980, the personnel at 2 U.S. Air Force bases in Suffolk, England, witnessed multiple UFOs that remain unidentified to this day. One officer even claims to have made physical contact with the craft. An investigation by multiple intelligence agencies from both the U.S. and the U.K. provided no concrete explanation. So what really happened that night? Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt's memo describes 3 star-like lights witnessed roughly 10 degrees above the horizon. The brightest hovered for 2 to 3 hours, occasionally streaming down light. So maybe it was a spacecraft, or maybe not.
According to the British Astronomical Society, between 9:07 and 9:08 p.m. on December 25, 1980, a Russian satellite re-entering the atmosphere burned up. The debris identified was from the Cosmos 749 satellite launched in 1975.
But satellite re-entry usually lasts minutes, not hours or days. Might there be a more terrestrial explanation?
There's a really interesting conspiracy theory that there is something called Project Bluebeam. Now, Project Bluebeam is the idea that you would use a combination of holographic technology, Hollywood special effects, and government spin to create a false narrative. One of the theories about Rendlesham is that they were testing this using holographic projection technology.
And holograms can store a lot of data, potentially everything that has ever existed.
Some physicists studying quantum gravity assert that the universe may be holographic due to quantum entanglement. So it's theoretically conceivable that these men were tricked by a hologram, especially considering a program that the US was testing at this time.
There's an official document called The Role of Behavioral Science in Physical Security. And it's all about questions such as how would a guard force respond to unusual stimuli. The fact that it was published fairly shortly before the Rendlesham incident has made some people wonder.
Could there have been some sort of military readiness check at Rendlesham, of which the base commander and security detail were deliberately kept in the dark? If it was such a test exercise, it seems highly unlikely that they'd have gone to the trouble of such a detailed investigation after the event. One of the supposedly landed craft that Jim Penniston claims to have encountered, and the strange effects of the force field that surrounded it.
Strong magnetic fields can definitely affect the brain, as can strong electrostatic fields. In this case, the beams of light suggest that it was more likely some kind of ion flux, for example, an ion plasma, and that could have explained why the hairs were standing up on end.
A more simple and obvious explanation is that something could have been wrong with Penniston, which impaired his faculties.
It could have been a psychological fugue state due to sensory overload. When the brain gets overwhelmed with sensory information, to protect itself, it simply shuts down sometimes.
That could also explain why Penniston claimed there was complete silence at the scene. Even his feet on the forest floor made no noise.
There is no known mechanism that could completely turn an environment silent, unless it directly affected the brain or auditory system. Electromagnetic energy has been shown to be able to do that.
And one of Penniston's claims to having seen an actual craft.
The only thing in that era that even comes close is the F-117, and I can't see any reason why the US government would have flown it over that time, that place.
And even if it was in the region, how could it, as Penniston described, have rested on pillars of light?
Technically, it is possible for shafts of light to play a role in levitating a craft. For example, if you had a magnetodynamic ion thruster or an electrostatic ion thruster, or more exotically, a laser photon pressure thruster, it could cause levitation associated with light beams.
But all of these propulsion mechanisms are highly theoretical. If light beams played a role, it was through non-terrestrial or highly classified technology.
And the most fascinating aspect of the site, which remained unexplained, was the emission of incredibly high levels of radiation.
My time on the MOD's UFO program was 91 to 94, so after Rendlesham. But this was clearly the biggest case in our files, so I reopened the investigation. I went through the witness statements, went through all the documents, rechecked the data with government scientists. One aspect that particularly interested me was the level of radioactivity, because there've been lots of figures bandied around over the years. So I rechecked the data, and it transpired that the levels taken were 6.66 times higher than the average background levels.
For Nick Pope, who has re-examined the evidence in detail, the fact that there were spiking levels of radiation remains the most telling aspect of the case.
The implication from the physical data is that there was indeed a solid craft present, and that it did emit high levels of heat and energy, and indeed radioactivity. And there's a declassified UK intelligence assessment of UFOs more generally, entitled Project Condign. There's a line in there that says the well-reported Rendlesham incident is a case where it might be postulated that witnesses were exposed to UAP radiation for longer periods than normal.
Richard Doty, formerly an investigator for the United States Air Force Office of Special Investigations, has also seen the official findings of the radiation study and agrees with Pope.
An OSI forensics team arrived at Rendlesham Forest on January 5th, 1981. The team conducted an extensive forensics examination of the bark, the soil, and the plants around the area of this alleged incident. They found a high level of alpha radiation. A further examination of the soil, the plants, and the bark found that the molecular structure of the plants were changed. The Air Force Office of Special Investigations forensics team sent it to the Department of Agriculture laboratory. And one of the things they tried to do was imitate the molecular structure being changed in the plant, the bark, and the soil. And the Department of Agriculture couldn't imitate it.
The evidence appears to support Peniston's claims that he did indeed encounter a physical craft of some kind that night, and that it emitted radiation. But if so, from where might it have come? The symbols Peniston saw on the side of the craft might hold the key. The symbols were enlarged and sent to cryptologist and mathematician George Daglish.
The first symbol looks to me like a vessel with a steering oar afloat in some sort of medium. The second symbol looks like a glyph associated with a mathematical idea known as the Fibonacci series, which is found everywhere in nature. The root of a Fibonacci series, 1, 2, and 3, taken as a whole, which is a rather clever glyph, all in one. They could represent an apse in an orbit, a perigee, or an apogee. And if they are apses, apogees and perigees, it means that the orbiter is doing a highly precessive orbit, like that. So, if you were going to survey a planet, and this is an orbiter, I assume, which would be a very sensible arrangement if you were using the vehicle as a surveying vehicle, because you would get a maximum look at the planet. I don't think they were trying to send us a metaphysical message about the beauty of life or the reason for the universe or anything like that, or their own existence. I think it's just more a utilitarian marking so they knew what craft they were dealing with.
Peniston claimed that his encounter with the craft triggered a telepathic transmission of binary code into his mind.
A lot of reputable scientists think that there is something mathematical woven into the very fabric of the universe, which is why we get things like the Fibonacci ratio expressed in everything from pineapples to the way trees branch, or fractal geometry. These things seem to be not descriptions of the universe, but actually maybe part of the universe.
The binary code that Peniston claimed to receive was translated by a team of researchers led by Linda Moulton Howe, a journalist and a ufologist. The team included Nick Seisk, a web developer and programmer. He decoded the binary code into ASCII characters.
When they analyzed the binary code, they uncovered 7 sets of geographical coordinates. When studying them further, it becomes apparent the coordinates are a code within the code, all of which point to a timeline or a precessional cycle clock, marking cataclysmic events in Earth's existence. Sometimes referred to as the Giza Diagonal, these are recurring major events within a 25,920-year cycle timeline.
25,920 years is a significant number. We've known for thousands of years that the Earth precesses on its axis, and it takes around 25,900 years to complete a single precession.
The decoding process of Peniston's code has attracted a lot of doubt and criticism.
There is no known technology that can decipher ones and zeros. It's just not mathematically possible. You can impose meaning on anything you want, right? And so, yeah, you can look at those ones and zeros and figure out that, ooh, there's some spooky secret coordinates. Sure, you can do that, but that doesn't mean that that's what they are.
That's not how Peniston sees it. He claims the message isn't from extraterrestrials, but from our future selves, which is why we were able to decode it.
The craft itself had inherent things that only humans would put on their craft. One is they use a triangular craft. Second, they put markings on the side of their craft like we do. And the other thing is the binary. It was in English. I never believed it was extraterrestrial. It's clearly us from the future.
There is some new research on quantum entanglement and a phenomenon called retrocausality, where in theory, some physicists think that it might be possible for creating an act in the future and having it impact the present or past. See, it all has to do with the wave function of quantum particles. Things can exist simultaneously, not only in space, but in present, past, and future. We can't say categorically something like that is impossible.
The one thing that everyone can agree on is that Peniston and Halt experienced something inexplicable.
Both Peniston and Halt were highly respected officers placed in positions of trust before and after this incident, and with high levels of security clearance.
But even if they did see something that night, there remains significant doubt over whether their accounts reflect what they think they saw.
About 48 hours after the incident, they sat me down and asked me to produce a statement and not to leave anything out. I wrote 4 pages, signed it, and initialed each page. Later, I was given a half a page of typed text, a watered-down version. They told me, "You memorize this, and that's the story you'll tell people when they ask you. It'll all go away if that's what you say to people." What was in the public domain was not my statement.
There is some truth that some of the witnesses were hypnotized. They transgressed a number of airmen who claimed to have actual physical contact with the craft and with the beings that apparently came outside the craft.
People under hypnosis are highly suggestible. If Jim Peniston is to be believed, the OSI had a preferred version of the story, and they were willing to force that version upon their witnesses.
A year after I retired in 1994, 13 years after the incident, a medical doctor referred me to a psychiatrist who specialized in hypnotic regression. In the second session, she had me talk about the incident in Rendlesham Forest. It all came out during the hypnosis. I had no recollection of the binary code until then. That's why I never spoke about the binary code until years later. I had no idea that in 1980 I was hypnotized and drugged. They asked me back one day later on the 30th, but I don't remember that. That's when they drugged me and blocked my memory of the binary code. I don't know what they gave me. I don't know if it's sodium pentothal or not, but it blocked my memory.
Signing altered briefs is by no means unusual in the military.
It's done all the time to cover the asses of the brass.
It was only thanks to some good fortune that Peniston still had the notebook with his drawings and notes.
The OSI didn't know I had a notebook. Actually, on the 29th, when I was asked to report to the OSI building, I took my notebook along with me. It had 3 of my drawings of the craft. I was going to hand my notebook over, but they never asked for it. When I got a sanitized version of my brief, I knew not to hand it over. It would have been confiscated.
With governments on both sides of the Atlantic taking this case so seriously, why does so much confusion and so many doubts persist?
It's certain that in this case, both the UK and the US did not share everything they had with their partner.
After the incident was reported to OSI in December of 1980, there were a number of different US government agencies involved in this, and one particular UK agency, the Ministry of Defense, OSI, the National Security Agency, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. CIA never shared what they found regarding the Rendlesham Forest incident until 1982. The National Security Agency withheld what they found until well into 1980. 2003.
The ripples from the Rendlesham Forest case can still be felt today. With all the evidence analyzed and all the angles considered, what do our experts make of the case?
So, over 40 years on, this is completely unknown. And indeed, that's the conclusion of the Ministry of Defense. The case file is technically still open. No definitive explanation was ever found.
And the OSI's official report?
This report that I read in headquarters in 1984 listed that the plausible explanation could have been extraterrestrial contact by unknown entities. That was in the final report.
I think that they saw something extraordinary that is far from the realm of normal human experience, and that I don't think there's any logical explanation for it. Something real happened. And honestly, I don't think we have any clue what it was.
Whistleblower David Grush recently claimed before Congress that the U.S. military has had a decades-long top-secret program to reverse engineer recovered UFOs. Could it be that the craft at Rendlesham was recovered by the U.S. Air Force and is still being held at a secret location today?
To me, the evidence suggests that the Rendlesham Forest UFO case was a joint psyop between the USAF, the OSI, and RAF. The location of the sighting, the inconsistencies in witness testimony, and the questionable binary code download all point to a staged event. The full truth may never be known, but it is clear that the Rendlesham Forest UFO case will continue to fascinate and intrigue people for years to come.